Did you know New Zealand once in its history sent some of the quietest but deadliest aircraft into World War II? These are not giant factories, no endless fleets, just tough machines, hard flown, far from home, who are doing work that rarely makes headlines. Kiwi pilots flew through ocean storms, burning skies, and long, empty distances where mistakes meant nothing came back alive. Well, in this video, we're breaking down every New Zealand deadliest aircraft used in World War II, and the roles they played. So, don't blink because what comes next is totally beyond your expectations. Corsair, you can almost feel the shift when the Corsair entered New Zealand service in 1944, because this was the moment older fighters quietly stepped aside. RNZAF squadrons suddenly had something heavier in their hands, something that didn't just chase enemy aircraft, but could tear into the ground itself. The Corsair was wildly fast for its time, as built with a toughness that made sense in the South Pacific, where heat, salt, and rough airfields punished everything that landed. Pilots took it up against Japanese aircraft, but the real work often came lower, smashing positions on Bougainville and Green Island, where the war crawled through jungle and coral. Takeoffs could feel ugly, even unforgiving, like wrestling something that didn't want to leave the ground. Yet once it broke free and settled into the sky, many Kiwi pilots found their confidence again. Up there, this machine stopped feeling like metal and started feeling like a partner. Curtiss P-40 Kitty Hawk. If any aircraft felt like it belonged to the rough early days, it was the P-40. New Zealand received large numbers of Kitty Hawks under Lend-Lease from 1942, right when the Pacific War was tightening its grip. These fighters met Zeros and dive bombers head-on, and they didn't arrive empty-handed. WRNZAF. Pilots scored many aerial victories in them, often while flying from half-finished strips carved out of island ground. Later on, when the nature of the fighting changed, crews began strapping on whatever worked, even naval depth charges, turning the P-40 into a blunt instrument for pounding ground targets. Nothing about it was glamorous. It could be temperamental, heavy in the hands, and stubborn when treated gently. But that toughness mattered. The Kitty Hawk survived abuse, absorbed damage, and kept coming back. For many Kiwi pilots, that mattered more than elegance ever could. Lockheed Ventura. The Ventura never tried to impress anyone. From 1943 to 1946, multiple RNZAF squadrons flew this twin-engine patrol bomber across the long, empty stretches of the Pacific, where missions weren't measured in minutes, but in endurance. Its world was water and cloud, on patrolling ocean lanes for enemy submarines and shadowing ship movements that might never fully reveal themselves. Reliable is a quiet word, but it fits here. The Ventura had the range to chase things that barely existed as shapes on the horizon, sometimes across thousands of miles. Crews trusted it not because it looked heroic, but because it kept running. There were jokes whispered in cockpits about running out of oil before fuel, but the kind of dark humor that only forms when endurance becomes routine. Out there, without drama or witnesses, the Ventura did the watching, and that watching kept people alive. Consolidated PBY Catalina. The Catalina arrived in RNZAF service in 1943 and immediately slipped into roles most aircraft could never touch. Numbers 5 and 6 squadrons took these amphibious flying boats out over vast Pacific waters where runways didn't exist and distance felt endless. Patrol work filled long hours. Night bombing came quietly. Search and rescue cut straight to the point of survival, This slow giant wasn't built to dodge or sprint. It was built to stay. Again and again, crews lived because the Catalina could drop onto open sea, settling among waves to pull people out who otherwise would have vanished. In a war where speed often decided everything, this aircraft proved something else mattered too. The ability to wait. The ability to land where no one else could. The ability to turn empty water into a place someone could come back from. Supermarine Walrus. Nothing about the Walrus looked threatening, and that may have been its quiet advantage. This odd, three-seat reconnaissance amphibious aircraft had already been serving since the mid-1930s and continued through World War II, tucked into roles most fighters never saw. Carried aboard cruisers, it lifted off from ships to spot enemy movement across wide seas, then came back to the same decks it left. When airmen went down, it went looking, splashing onto open water to rescue survivors who had already started making peace with the idea of being forgotten. Its clunky shape never promised power, yet its ability to land, float, and lift again changed outcomes. Enemies rarely paid it much attention. Crews always did. While headlines followed faster aircraft, the Walrus quietly saved lives. Often forgotten, it may have brought more people home than many machines built purely for combat. The Lockheed Hudson. In the early war, the RNZAF flew just 36 Hudsons, and nearly all of them went into the quiet grind of patrol work. This was a reliable patrol bomber, but its life rarely stayed within neat labels. One day meant long reconnaissance sweeps over an empty ocean. Another meant light bombing runs across the South Pacific, slipping from watcher to striker without ceremony. Glamour never followed it. The Hudson earned a different reputation instead. One built on toughness over open water, where salt, storms, and isolation did as much damage as any enemy. Crews came to see it as a workhorse in the truest sense, the kind of aircraft that didn't shine but didn't fail. Missions ended the same way more often than not, with tired engines, tired men, and the simple relief that the job had been done again. De Havilland Mosquito. There's something almost reckless about an aircraft made largely of wood showing up in a war of steel, yet that gamble became the Mosquito's edge. Built light and fast, it was hard to catch, and number 487, NZ Squadron, took full advantage of that after moving on from the Ventura phase. Across the war, they stacked up thousands of sorties, not the kind that made for parade stories, but the kind that altered infrastructure and left silence behind. This aircraft went after power stations, rail lines, and high-value buildings, places meant to keep wars running. The crews didn't talk much about those flights afterward, and the Mosquito never pretended to be heroic. It was simply efficient. Speed, surprise, and precision wrapped into a shape that didn't belong to old rules. When it appeared, something important usually stopped working soon after. Vickers Wellington. Years before bombs began falling, New Zealand ordered 30 Wellingtons in 1938, and crews crossed oceans to England to learn them. Training barely had time to settle before the war took over. By July 1939, they were re-equipped with Wellington Mark I aircraft, and almost without announcement, the idea of a New Zealand squadron began forming around those bombers. The Wellington's world lived at night. Cold crept into the gloves. Flak tore the sky. Engines became something you listened to more than you flew with. Long returns were measured in sound and faith, counting each motor like a promise. These weren't flights you dramatized. They were endured. The Wellington carried New Zealand's airmen into the heart of Europe's darkness, where distance, fear, and exhaustion became as real as any target on a map. Supermarine Spitfire. Imagine stepping into a war already burning and being operational a month later. That's what happened in March 1941, when 485 NZ Squadron formed and almost immediately began flying Spitfires. It started with convoy cover, then escorts, then aggressive sweeps meant to pull the Luftwaffe into the open. Over time, the role shifted. The Spitfire slid into fighter bomber work, hammering targets in Normandy as the build-up to D-Day thickened. The danger never stayed in one shape. In early 1945, during Operation Bodenplatte, several of these aircraft were destroyed on the ground, caught where safety was supposed to exist. That moment alone tells you what these pilots lived with. Even parked, even waiting, even breathing, the war could still reach out and take something from you. Gegrummen TBF-1 Avenger. By 1943 and 1944, 48 Avengers reached New Zealand hands, earmarked to build up numbers 30 and 31 squadrons for Pacific operations. On paper, it was a torpedo bomber. In reality, it became something more uncomfortable. Crews flew shipping strikes and pressed island bases where enemies were often hidden, not faced. The work felt practical, almost industrial, hitting supply lines and isolated positions where destruction mattered more than spectacle. Faces were rarely seen. Outcomes were. Some of these aircraft were even returned to the United States later in 1944, a quiet sign of how quickly wartime needs twisted and reshaped entire fleets. The Avengers story sits in that space between design and necessity, where an aircraft becomes whatever the war demands, even when the job isn't one anyone wants to talk about afterward. Douglas SBD Dauntless. You don't really fly a Dauntless the way you do other aircraft. At some point, you point it straight down and trust yourself to pull out before the ground decides for you. That's exactly what RNZAF crews were doing between 1943 and 1944, when number 25 Squadron was equipped with the Dauntless during the Solomon Islands campaign. Operating out of Bougainville, these aircraft went after Japanese positions again and again, striking places tied to the pressure building around Rabaul. The Dauntless carried a reputation that fit its shape: small, compact, and brutally honest about what it was built to do. Dive bombing meant committing early, letting the aircraft scream toward a target while every second stretched longer than it should. It wasn't about elegance, it was about angles, timing, and nerve. In spirit, this machine embodied small but lethal, because once it tipped forward, there was no halfway version of the job. Douglas C-47 Dakota. If you strip war of its noise and look at what actually keeps it alive, you end up staring at something like the Dakota. The RNZAF brought the C-47 into service in 1943 with No. 40 Squadron, and almost immediately, it became the backbone of moving men and supplies across the Pacific. Its battlefield wasn't marked by tracers or dogfights. It was marked by distance, endless water, unfriendly weather, the quiet risk of engines droning for hours with nowhere to go but forward. The Dakota didn't chase enemies. It fed bases. It lifted wounded bodies out of places they couldn't survive. It stitched islands together into something that could function like a war instead of a scattering of outposts. Not glamorous, not dramatic, but deadly in a different way. Without it, operations stalled, troops starved, and the injured stayed where they fell. Vickers Vincent Picture, an aircraft that already looked old when the war began, and then picture it still going anyway. That was the Vincent. Right at the start of World War II, so New Zealand used this British-built biplane for coastal patrol, torpedo work, and the slow business of spotting submarines along shipping routes. Compared with fighters, it felt like a relic, all struts and fabric lines, but its work carried a different weight. These were long, lonely patrols, flown without dogfights or dramatic endings. Most missions ended the same way they began, with more ocean and more waiting. Crews watched the water for hours, knowing that danger rarely announced itself. Many airmen passed entire tours without medals or headlines, just nights filled with engine noise and eyes fixed on dark waves. In Vincent, war didn't rush. It crept. Vickers Wildebeest. There's a certain stubbornness in flying an aircraft that time has already started to erase. The Wildebeest was another heavy British biplane that served with RNZAF squadrons early in the Pacific War, long after faster, cleaner designs existed elsewhere. It took on torpedo bombing, coastal defense, and reconnaissance roles where survival depended less on speed and more on persistence. Crews often flew it well past what anyone would have called a comfortable lifespan, lifting into bad weather and uncertain skies in aircraft already edging toward obsolescence. Enemy action was only part of the threat. Wear, fatigue, and mechanical limits lived in the cockpit too. The Wildebeest didn't outrun much. It endured. And sometimes, in the early Pacific, wars endurance was the only advantage New Zealand airmen had. Short Sunderland. Some aircraft carried war overseas. The Sunderland carried it across water that never seemed to end. Entering RNZAF service in 1944, this four-engine flying boat became one of the force's longest-enduring heavy patrol aircraft. Its world was maritime reconnaissance and convoy escort, stretched across thousands of miles of open ocean. Crews lived inside storms, navigated by instinct and instruments, and often found themselves as the only air cover for ships that could not defend themselves. Missions lasted for hours without rest, the kind that quietly wore people down long before they ever reached a target area. Isolation became part of the job. So did the dread that comes from knowing how far you are from help. In some of the harshest skies and seas imaginable, the Sunderland didn't rush. It stayed, watched, and waited. New Zealand's air war wasn't built on massive numbers or constant headlines. It was built on distance, endurance, and pilots who kept flying when attention faded. These aircraft tell a quieter story of World War II, one shaped by isolation, adaptability, and machines that carried far more than weapons. They carried survival. If these aircraft surprised you, then hit like, subscribe, and stay with us. More untold history is coming. Thanks for watching. We will catch you in the next one.